Jake Harrison sat at his desk, staring at the message that had just arrived. The holographic display flickered with official seals from 12 different alien species. Each seal represented a race that had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years. Each seal meant trouble for humanity. The message was short but carried weight that made Jake's stomach turn. The Galactic Council demanded his immediate presence at the Grand Assembly on Centauri Prime. This was not a request. This was a summons that could decide whether humanity remained part of galactic civilization or found itself. Cast out into the cold darkness of space, Jake rubbed his tired eyes and called for his aide. Lisa Morgan entered his office within seconds, her face already showing she knew bad news was coming. She had worked with Jake for 3 years at the human embassy on Kepler Station. She could read his expressions better than anyone. "They want us at Centauri Prime," Jake told her, gesturing. At the holographic message, "All 12 species signed this thing." When was the last time that happened? Lisa checked her tablet quickly. Not for over 200 years. The last time was when they declared war on the Void Hunters. She looked up at Jake with worry in her eyes. What did we do wrong this time? Jake stood and walked to the large window that looked out over Kepler Station. The massive space station served as a neutral meeting place for dozens of species. Ships from across the galaxy docked here daily. Human vessels looked small and simple next to the elegant alien craft that filled the docking bays. 3 words, Jake said quietly. Zephyrian refugee crisis? Lisa's face went pale. Everyone in the diplomatic corps knew about the situation brewing in human space. 3 human colonies had been found harboring refugees from the Spherian Empire. These were not criminals or terrorists. They were families, scientists, artists, and teachers who had fled their homeworlds to escape something terrible. The Zephyrian Empire ruled over 40 star systems with an iron fist. The government allowed no dissent, no free speech, no independent thought. Anyone who questioned the state simply disappeared. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones faced worse fates. "How many refugees are we talking about?" Lisa asked. "Last count was over 50,000, Jake replied. "More arrive every week. They come in small ships, sometimes just escape pods. They tell stories that would make you sick." Jake had read the classified reports. Dr. Alina Vasquez, the chief researcher at the refugee camps, had interviewed hundreds of the Zephyrian escapees. Children drew pictures of soldiers killing their parents. Scientists spoke of research being banned because it made people think too much. Artists had their hands broken for creating works that showed hope instead of despair. "The council wants us to hand them over," Jake said. "The Zephyrians are demanding their return for what they call processing." Lisa shuddered. Everyone knew what Zephyrian processing meant. The refugees would be lucky to die within the first day. A chime sounded, indicating another message had arrived. This one came from Earth itself, from President Karen Mitchell's office. Jake opened it and read. Quickly, his face grew grim. "The president wants me to negotiate," he said. "She's sending a list of acceptable compromises. We can keep some refugees in exchange for territorial concessions. We can limit the number we accept in the future. We can help the Zephyrians track down other escapees." Lisa looked at the message over his shoulder. "Those sound like reasonable diplomatic solutions." Jake turned away from the window. Something in his expression had changed. Lisa had seen him handle dozens of difficult situations, but this was different. This felt personal. "Get Colonel Ryan Brooks on the come," Jake ordered. "I want to know exactly what we're facing if this goes wrong." Within minutes, Colonel Brooks appeared on the holographic display. The military advisor looked as tired as Jake felt. Brooks had been dealing with the security implications of the refugee crisis for months. "Colonel, give me the straight truth," Jake said. "What happens if we refuse to cooperate with the council?" Brooks sighed deeply. "Economic isolation for starters. No more trade with the 12 ruling species. That's about 60% of our commerce right there. Then comes the technology embargo. No more access to galactic databases, no more medical knowledge, no more scientific cooperation. And militarily, we'd be on our own. Humanity has maybe 200 warships spread across our colonies. The Zephyrian Empire alone has over 3,000. If they decided to take those refugees by force, we couldn't stop them. Jake nodded. Slowly, the numbers were clear. Humanity was still the new kid in the galactic neighborhood. 50 years since first contact wasn't enough time to build the kind of power needed to stand alone. There's something else, Brooks continued. Intelligence suggests some of the council species are getting tired of human independence. They think we ask too many questions, challenge too many established practices. This refugee situation might be the excuse they've been looking for to put us in our place. After Brooks signed off, Jake sat in silence for several minutes. Lisa waited patiently, knowing he was working through the problem in his mind. She had seen him find creative solutions to impossible situations before. Prep the Aurora for departure. Jake finally said, "Full diplomatic mission. I want our best translators, cultural specialists, and legal experts." "What's our negotiating position?" Lisa asked. Jake looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'm still working on that." The next day, Jake stood on the bridge of the Aurora as it prepared to leave Kepler Station. The ship was small by galactic standards, but represented the best of human technology. It could travel faster than light, survive in the harshest environments, and carry a full diplomatic team with all their equipment. Captain Amy Rodriguez ran through the final checks. She was one of the few humans who had earned respect from alien crews. Her calm competence under pressure had saved lives during the Proxima Station crisis 2 years earlier. "Course laid in for Centauri Prime," Rodriguez reported. "Travel time at maximum safe speed is 4 days." Jake nodded. "For days to figure out how to save 50,000 lives without dooming humanity to isolation or worse? For days to find a way to stand up to the most powerful beings in the galaxy." As the Aurora left Kepler Station behind, Jake went to his quarters and began reading everything he could find about the refugees. Dr. Vasquez's reports made difficult reading. These were not statistics or political pawns. They were real people who had risked everything for the chance at freedom. One report stood out. A Zephyrian scientist named Kekstar had developed a new form of agriculture that could feed millions. When he tried to share his research freely, instead of giving it to the military, he was marked for execution. He escaped with his family in a cargo pod, surviving on recycled air for 3 weeks. Before reaching human space, another report described a group of Zephyrian children who had been taught that asking questions was a crime against the state. It took months of patient work before they would even speak to the human counselors. Now they attended school on New Geneva, learning that curiosity was something to be celebrated, not punished. Jake closed the files and stared out at the stars rushing past. Somewhere ahead lay Centauri Prime and the Grand Assembly. In 4 days, he would face beings who had ruled the galaxy since before humans discovered fire. They would expect him to be reasonable, to compromise, to find a solution that everyone could live with. The problem was that Jake had begun to realize that some things were not worth compromising about. Some lines should not be crossed, no matter the cost. Some principles were more important than survival itself. He just hoped he would have the courage to act on that belief when the time came. The Aurora dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Centauri system. Jake Harrison stood on the bridge, watching as Centauri Prime grew larger on the main screen. The planet looked peaceful from space, with blue oceans and white clouds. It was hard to believe that the most powerful beings in the galaxy lived on its surface. Captain Amy Rodriguez worked at her station, coordinating their approach with Centauri traffic control. Hundreds of ships filled the space around the planet. Jake could see vessels from every major species in the galaxy. Some were massive warships that could destroy entire worlds. Others were elegant diplomatic craft that looked more like works of art than spaceships. "They're all here for us," Lisa Morgan said quietly, as she joined Jake at the viewing window. "Every species that matters sent their best ships." Jake nodded. The message was clear. This was not a normal diplomatic meeting. This was a trial, and humanity was the one being judged. The Grand Assembly building rose from the surface of Centauri Prime, like a mountain made of crystal and metal. It reached so high into the atmosphere that its top disappeared into the clouds. The structure had been built over 1,000 years ago when the 12 ruling species first formed the Galactic Council. As the Aurora landed at the diplomatic port, Jake could see ships from all 12 species arranged in a perfect circle around the human vessel. The symbolism was obvious. 12 ancient powers surrounding one newcomer. 12 judges preparing to hear evidence against one defendant. Jake gathered his team in the Aurora's briefing room before they left the ship. Lisa had prepared detailed files on each species they would face. Colonel Brooks attended via holographic link from Earth, providing last-minute security updates. Remember, Jake told his team, we're not just representing humanity today. We're representing the idea that doing what's right matters more than doing what's convenient. Dr. Helen Parker, the team's xenobiologist, looked nervous. These beings have ruled the galaxy since before humans developed agriculture. Dave, seen civilizations rise and fall? What makes us think we can change their minds about anything? Jake looked at each member of his team. These were good people who had devoted their lives to building bridges between species. They believed in diplomacy, in finding common ground, in making deals that everyone could accept. Maybe we can't change their minds, Jake said. But we can. Make sure they understand exactly what they're asking us to do. The walk from the Aurora to the Grand Assembly building took 20 minutes. Jake and his team moved through corridors filled with beings from across the galaxy. Some looked almost human, while others were so alien that Jake had trouble figuring out which end was their head. The corridor walls displayed holographic images of galactic history. Jake saw the rise of the first interstellar civilizations, the great wars that had shaped the current order, the establishment of the council system that had brought peace to most of the galaxy. But Jake also noticed what was missing from these displays. There were no images of dissent, no mention of species that had been forced to conform, no acknowledgement of the cost of galactic peace. History, it seemed, was written by the winners. The Grand Assembly chamber was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. The room was so large that it had its own weather system, with clouds forming near the ceiling and gentle rain falling in distant corners. 12 massive platforms rose from the floor, each one designed for a different species. The Catherian platform buzzed with insectoid activity. Hundreds of worker drones moved around their queen, Council Speaker Vextel. Her massive form dominated the center of their section, her compound eyes reflecting light like jewels. The Zephyrian platform looked like a military fortress. High Counselor Zertek stood at its center, his reptilian form covered in ceremonial armor that gleamed under the chamber's lights. Behind him, a dozen Zephyrian officials arranged themselves in perfect formation. Jake's team was given a small section on the chamber floor. They looked up at the towering alien platforms like insects studying giants. The size difference was intentional, Jake realized. It was meant to remind lesser species of their place in the galactic order. Council Speaker Vextel called the session to order. Her voice came through translation devices that converted her chittering sounds into words every species could understand. The Grand Assembly convenes to address violations of the sacred doctrine of non-interference, she announced. The species known as humanity stands accused of harboring fugitives from the Zephyrian Empire in direct violation of galactic law. High Counselor Zertek stepped forward on his platform, his cold reptilian eyes fixed on Jake as he began to speak.
Honored
Council members, Zertek said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. The Zephyrian Empire has presented clear evidence of human crimes against galactic order. 3 human colonies have become havens for criminals and dissidents who flee Zephyrian justice. Holographic displays filled the air around Zertek's platform. They showed images of human colonies, refugee camps, and what Zertek claimed were stolen Zephyrian vessels being dismantled by human engineers. These fugitives, Zertek continued, are not innocent victims as humanity claims. They are terrorists, thieves, and traitors who have committed crimes against the Zephyrian state. By harboring them, humanity violates not only our bilateral agreements, but the fundamental principle that has kept the galaxy peaceful for centuries. Jake watched as other council members nodded in agreement. The aquatic hydranians expressed their concerns through color changes that rippled across their translucent bodies. The energy-based luminary pulsed with what Jake's translator identified as disapproval. Representative Caltex of the Hydranian Assembly spoke next. Her voice bubbled through the water-filled helmet that allowed her to survive in the chamber's atmosphere. The Hydranian people have always supported the principle of non-interference, she said. If we allow individual species to decide which laws apply to them, we risk returning to the chaos of the old days. The precedent humanity wishes to set could destabilize the entire galactic order. The luminary representative, a being of pure energy contained within a crystalline form, added their concerns. Their communication came as patterns of light that the translation system converted to words. Balance must be maintained, the luminary said. Each species must respect the sovereignty of others. The human action disrupts the cosmic harmony have worked millennia to achieve. Even the Corellians, who Jake had hoped might support humanity, expressed disappointment. Representative Morden, a mammalian being who looked somewhat like a cross between a wolf and a bear, shook his massive head sadly. The Corellian Republic has enjoyed good relations with humanity, Morden said. This makes their violation of galactic law even more disappointing. We had hoped that humans would learn to respect the wisdom of established order. One by one, the council members voiced their concerns. Some spoke of legal precedent. Others worried about encouraging rebellion among their own subject species. A few mentioned the economic disruption that would follow if every species started ignoring inconvenient laws. Jake listened to it all, taking notes and trying to understand each species' perspective. These beings weren't evil. They genuinely believed that galactic peace required strict adherence to established rules. They had seen what happened when order broke down, when species fought each other for resources and territory. But Jake also heard what they weren't saying. None of them asked what the Zephorian refugees were fleeing from. None of them questioned whether Zephorian justice was actually just. None of them seemed to care about the lives that hung in the balance. Finally, Council Speaker Vassell turned to Jake. Her compound eyes reflected the chamber's lights as she spoke. Ambassador Harrison, she said, you will now present humanity's response to these charges. The Council is prepared to hear your proposed solution to this crisis. Jake stood, slowly, feeling the weight of thousands of alien eyes upon him.
Armies.
His team looked up at him expectantly. Lisa Morgan held her tablet ready. It's filled with carefully prepared compromises in diplomatic language. The chamber fell completely silent. Even the distant weather systems seemed to pause. Jake looked up at the towering platforms, at beings who had ruled the galaxy. Since before his species had left their home planet, he thought about the refugee reports he had read on the journey here. He thought about children who had drawn pictures of their murdered parents. He thought about scientists whose research had been banned for encouraging independent thought. He thought about families who had risked everything for the simple hope of freedom. Jake took a deep breath and prepared to give the most important speech of his life. Jake Harrison looked up at the towering alien platforms surrounding him. 12 species that had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years waited for his response. The silence in the massive chamber felt heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. Lisa Morgan held her tablet ready, filled with carefully crafted diplomatic language. The prepared response offered territorial concessions, limits on future refugees, and assistance in tracking down other escapees. It was reasonable, practical, and would probably satisfy the council. But Jake did not reach for the tablet. Instead, began to speak in a quiet voice that somehow carried clearly through the vast chamber. Honored council members, Jake said, before I give humanity's response, I would like to tell you a story about my homeworld. Council Speaker Vextel's compound eyes shifted with what might have been confusion. This was not how diplomatic sessions usually began. Representatives typically opened with formal acknowledgments of the council's wisdom and authority. On Earth, Jake continued, there was once a time when humans who looked different from each other were bought and sold like property. Humans with dark skin were owned by humans with light skin. They were forced to work without pay, beaten if they disobeyed, and killed if they tried to escape. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Several council members exchanged glances.
Where was?
The human ambassador, going with this story. The humans who owned slaves had many good reasons for their actions, Jake said. They claimed it was legal under their laws. They said their economy would collapse without slave labor. They argued that slaves were better off being cared for than trying to survive on their own. High Counselor Zertek leaned forward on his platform, his cold reptilian eyes narrowed as he began to understand the direction of Jake's words. But there were other humans who said these reasons did not matter, Jake continued. They said that owning another thinking being was wrong no matter what the law said, no matter what the economic cost, no matter what the consequences. Jake paused and looked around the chamber. He could see confusion on some alien faces, anger. On others, this was not the diplomatic language they expected. These humans fought a war against slavery, Jake said. Brothers killed brothers. Fathers fought sons. Cities burned. Millions died. But when the war ended, no human could legally own another human anymore. Representative Caltex of the Hydranian Assembly spoke up, her voice bubbling through her water-filled helmet. Ambassador Harrison, while your species' history is interesting, we are here to discuss current violations of galactic law. How does this story relate to the refugee crisis? Jake turned to face the Hydranian platform. It relates because we learned something important from that war. We learned that some things are more important than law. Some things are more important than order. Some things are more important than peace itself. The chamber erupted in surprise, chittering, growling, and energy pulses. Never in the Council's history had a member species suggested that anything was more important than galactic. Peace. Council Speaker Vextel raised one of her massive clawed arms for silence. Ambassador Harrison, you speak of placing personal beliefs above the law that governs all civilized species. This is the path to chaos. Jake shook his head. With respect, Council Speaker, I speak of placing universal principles above convenient arrangements. He walked closer to the center of the chamber, making himself visible to all 12 platforms. I have read the reports about the Zephyrian refugees in our care, Jake said. I have seen the interviews conducted by Dr. Elena Vasquez. I have looked at the drawings made by children who watched their parents disappear in the night. Jake's voice grew stronger as he continued. These refugees are not criminals. They are teachers who were punished for encouraging students to ask questions. They are scientists who were marked for death because their research contradicted state doctrine. They are artists whose only crime was creating works that showed hope instead of despair. High Counselor Zeratek stood up on his platform, his armored form towering over the chamber. Ambassador Harrison, you speak of matters you do not understand. These individuals violated Zephyrian law. They spread discord and threatened the stability of our society. Jake looked directly up at the Zephyrian leader. What law did the children break? What crime did the families commit? What threat did the artists pose? They existed in a state of disorder, Zertek replied coldly. Order must be maintained. Stability must be preserved. The individual must serve the state. And if the state is wrong? Jake asked. The question hung in the air like a physical presence. For a moment, the massive chamber was completely silent. Even the distant weather system seemed to pause. Representative Morden of the Corellian Republic spoke carefully. Ambassador Harrison, you suggest that individual judgment can override established authority. This is how civilizations fall. This is how peace ends. Jake nodded slowly. You are right. This is how some kinds of peace end. But there are different kinds of peace, just as there are different kinds of order. He gestured toward the Zephyrian platform. High Counselor Zeratek has achieved perfect order in his empire. No one questions authority. No one speaks against the state. No one challenges the system. It is very peaceful. Jake's voice carried a note of sadness. It is the peace of the graveyard, the peace of the prison, the peace that comes when everyone who might speak out has been silenced forever. The luminary representative pulsed with patterns of light that translated as confusion. Ambassador Harrison, you speak as if order and justice are opposed. The council system has brought prosperity to the galaxy. Trade flows freely. Wars have ended. Billions of beings live in safety. And that is wonderful, Jake replied. But it has come at a cost. The cost is that when evil hides behind law, when cruelty wraps itself in legal language, when murder calls. It's self-processing. The galaxy looks the other way and calls it peace. Lisa Morgan stood up from her seat, her face pale. This was not the diplomatic response they had prepared. This was not the careful negotiation that might save humanity's place in galactic civilization. Jake, she whispered, the compromises. The territorial concessions? We can save some of them. Jake looked down at his aide, this woman who had worked so hard to find middle ground, to build bridges, to make everyone happy. He saw the fear in her eyes, the knowledge that he was about to destroy everything they had worked for. Lisa, he said gently, some bridges should not be built. Some middle ground should not be found. Some compromises should not be made. He turned back to face the council platforms. Honored council members, you have asked for humanity's response to your charges. You have asked for our proposed solution to this crisis. Jake took a deep breath. Around him, the massive chamber waited in complete silence. Beings who had ruled the galaxy for millennia hung on his next words. Humanity's response is this, Jake said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the vast space. We reject these negotiations entirely. The chamber exploded in chaos. Alien voices rose in anger, confusion, and disbelief. Energy beings pulsed with agitation. Insectoid drones buzzed frantically around their queen. The aquatic hydranians changed colors so rapidly that their forms became blurs. Council Speaker Vextel's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Ambassador Harrison, you cannot simply reject negotiations. This is not how the council system works. Jake stood calmly in the center of the storm. You are right, Council Speaker. This is not how your system works. Your system requires that we trade lives for convenience. Your system demands that we purchase peace with the blood of innocence. Your system insists that we choose between moral, cowardice, and galactic citizenship. He looked up at each platform in turn. We choose neither. We will not hand over the refugees in our care. We will not help you track down other escapees. We will not limit the number of beings we accept who seek freedom from tyranny. High Counselor Zertek's voice carried pure rage. You would risk the destruction of your entire species for a few thousand fugitives? Jake's answer came without hesitation. We would risk everything rather than become the kind of species that trades other people's lives for our own safety. The chamber fell silent again. In the history of the Galactic Council, no member species had ever simply refused to negotiate. No one had ever walked away from the table. No one had ever chosen principle over survival. Jake Harrison had just changed the rules of the game forever. The news of Jake Harrison's rejection spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. Within hours of the Grand Assembly session, every major news network was broadcasting the story. Human Diplomat had walked into the most powerful chamber in the galaxy and simply said no. On Earth, President Karen Mitchell sat in the Oval Office watching the reports with growing alarm. Her advisors filled the room, each one bringing worse news than the last. The Zephyrian Empire has closed all trade routes to human space, reported economic advisor Peter Chang. They're calling it a temporary security measure, but our merchant ships are being turned away at every border. Admiral Steve Coleman stepped forward with military updates. 3 Zephyrian battle fleets are moving toward the edge of human space. They're not crossing into our territory yet, but the message is clear. President Mitchell rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of humanity's future pressing down on her shoulders. What's the reaction from our allies? The Corellian Republic has issued a statement expressing disappointment in our actions, Chang replied. The Hydranian Assembly is calling for emergency economic sanctions. Even the minor species that usually support us are distancing themselves. On Centauri Prime, Jake Harrison sat in his assigned quarters under what amounted to diplomatic house arrest. The council had suspended the session after his rejection, claiming they needed time to consider. An unprecedented situation. In reality, Jake knew they were trying to figure out how to respond to something that had never happened before. Lisa Morgan paced back and forth across the small room. She had been quiet since leaving the assembly chamber, but Jake could see the storm building behind her eyes. Jake, what have we done? She finally asked. 50 years of diplomatic progress. 50 years of building relationships with alien species. He just threw it all away in 10 minutes. Jake sat quietly at the room's small desk, writing in his personal journal. He had been documenting everything he learned about the refugee situation, creating a record that might survive even if humanity didn't. "Did I throw it away, Lisa?" Jake asked, without looking up from his writing. "Or did I finally tell the truth about what kind of relationships we were building?" Lisa stopped pacing and stared at him. "You're talking about the end of human civilization as we know it? We can't survive alone against the entire galaxy." "Maybe not," Jake agreed. "But we also can't survive as the kind of species that sells other people's freedom for our own comfort." Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening across the galaxy. The story of the human diplomat who had simply walked away from the negotiating table was reaching beings who had never heard such a thing was possible. On the mining world of Kepler-4, for to be, a group of Andromedon workers watched the news reports in their cramped quarters. For 3 generations, their families had mined rare crystals for the Galactic Council, under conditions that barely qualified as slavery. "Did you hear what the human said?" whispered Veltar, an elderly Andromedan whose back was bent from decades. "In the mines," said, "some things are more important than order." His grandson, Kexmal, looked around nervously. "Grandfather, speaking like that is dangerous. Overseers have sensors everywhere." But Veltar's old eyes held a spark that hadn't been there in years. What if the human is right? What if we don't have to accept this just because it's legal? Similar conversations were happening on dozens of worlds. Species that had accepted oppression as the price of galactic peace began to ask questions they had never dared to voice before. On the trade world of Nova Centauri, a group of ethereal beings met in secret. Their species had joined the Galactic Council centuries ago, but had gradually lost their independence as larger species dominated their economy and politics. The human rejected their demands, pulsed Zarlin, her energy form flickering with excitement. He didn't try to negotiate or compromise, he just said no. "And look what happened," replied Morchex, his form dimming with worry. "The Council will destroy humanity for their defiance." "Will they?" asked Zarelin. "Or will they realize that? Their power depends on people being willing to accept it." Back on Earth, President Mitchell faced the hardest decision of her career. Her cabinet was split between those who wanted to recall Harrison and apologize to the Council, and those who supported his stand regardless of the consequences. "We could still fix this," urged Peter Chang. "Send a message to the Council apologizing for Harrison's unauthorized statements. Offer the territorial concessions, plus additional trade benefits." Admiral Coleman shook his head. "It's too late for that. Harrison made our position clear. If we back down now, we look weak and dishonest. The Council will never trust us again." Anyway, the President stood and walked to the window that looked out over Washington, D.C., somewhere out there. Human families were going about their daily lives, unaware that their government was deciding whether to risk everything for a principle. "What's the public reaction?" she asked. Mixed, replied Communications Director Nancy Ross. "About 60% support Harrison's stand when they understand what the refugees are fleeing from. But that drops to 30% when they learn about the potential consequences." The President nodded. Democracy was messy that way. People could support doing the right thing in theory, but became less enthusiastic when it might cost them personally. 3 days after Harrison's rejection, the first crack in the Council's unity appeared. The Ethereal Collective, one of the 12 ruling species, issued a surprising statement. "The Ethereal Collective has reviewed the human position with great interest," their spokesman announced. "While we cannot support violations of established law, we recognize that some situations require examination of the principles underlying those laws." It was diplomatic language, but the message was clear. The Ethereals were questioning whether the Council's position was morally defensible. Hi, Councillor Zyrtec of the Zephyrian Empire was not pleased. He called an emergency meeting of the Council's inner circle, demanding immediate action against both humanity and any species that showed sympathy for their position. "If we allow this human defiance to stand," Zyrtec argued, "every minor species in the galaxy will think they can ignore our authority. Order will collapse. Chaos will return." But Council Speaker Vextel found herself in an unexpected position. For the first time in her long career, She was receiving communications from species across the galaxy asking uncomfortable questions about Council policies. Meanwhile, Jake continued his work in diplomatic house arrest. He had managed to establish a secure communication channel with Dr. Elena Vasquez on Earth, allowing him to gather more detailed information about the refugee situation. The stories keep getting worse. Dr. Vasquez reported during one of their encrypted conversations, "We've discovered that the Zephyrian processing isn't just execution. They're harvesting neural tissue for some kind of consciousness transfer project." Jake felt sick. He had known the Zephyrian government was brutal, but this was beyond anything. He had imagined, how long have they been doing this, he asked. According to the refugees, at least 20 years. Maybe longer. Jake, there are entire research facilities dedicated to studying how to extract and transfer memories and personalities. Jake made careful notes of everything Dr. Vasquez told him. If this information could be verified and distributed, it would change how the galaxy viewed the Zephyrian Empire and the Council's willingness to protect them. Alina, I need you to document everything. Every interview, every piece of evidence, every detail about what these people escaped from. Make copies and hide them in different locations. Why? What are you planning? Jake looked out the window of his quarters at the alien city beyond. I'm planning to make sure the galaxy knows the truth, no matter what happens to humanity. As the days passed, the crisis deepened. More Zephyrian fleets moved toward human space. Economic sanctions began to bite as trade routes closed. Some human colonies reported shortages of essential supplies. But something else was happening that the Council hadn't expected. Species across the galaxy were watching to see what would happen to the humans who had dared to say no. For many of them, it was the first time they had seen someone refuse to compromise with injustice. The galaxy was holding its breath, waiting to see whether principle could survive in a universe where power made the rules. 3 months after Jake Harrison's rejection, the galaxy was a different place. What had started as one human's refusal to negotiate had grown into something much larger. Species across the galaxy were questioning laws they had accepted for centuries. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Marcus Chen, a human xenobiologist working on Earth, had been studying the archived records that Jake had smuggled out of his diplomatic quarters. Hidden in the vast database of galactic law was information that changed everything. Dr. Chen called President Mitchell directly with his discovery. Madam President, you need to see this immediately. The Zephyrian processing program isn't just murder. It's systematic harvesting of consciousness for transfer experiments. President Mitchell stared at the holographic display Dr. Chen had sent. The documents were official Zephyrian government records obtained from refugees who had worked. In their research facilities, they've been using dissidents as test subjects for over 30 years, Dr. Chen continued. The goal is to transfer the consciousness of high-ranking officials into younger bodies. The refugees we're protecting aren't just fleeing oppression. They're fleeing a government that literally steals people's bodies and minds. The president felt her stomach turn. Marcus, are you certain these documents are authentic? I've had them verified by 3 independent sources. Dr. Elena Vasquez confirmed the details with refugees who worked in the facilities. The evidence is solid. Within hours, copies of the documents were being transmitted to news networks across the galaxy. Lisa Morgan, still on Centauri Prime with Jake, managed to leak the information to journalists from dozens of species. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Species that had supported the Zephyrian position began to distance themselves from the Empire. The Hydranian Assembly issued a statement expressing shock at the revelations. Even the Corellian Republic called for an immediate investigation. But the biggest shock came from within the Zephyrian Empire itself. General Vaxter, commander of the Third Fleet, issued a statement that stunned the galaxy. I have served the Zephyrian Empire for 40 years, General Vaxter announced. I believed I was protecting our civilization from chaos and disorder. I did not know I was protecting monsters who'd steal the souls of our own people. The general's defection triggered a cascade of rebellions within the Zephyrian military. 3 more fleets declared independence from the Empire. Zephyrian colonies began declaring themselves free worlds. The iron grip that had held the Empire together for centuries began to crack. High Counselor Zertek tried to maintain control, but his authority was crumbling. When he ordered the remaining loyal fleets to attack the human colonies, half of his commanders refused to obey. On Centauri Prime, the Galactic Council faced a crisis unlike anything in their history. The Ethereal Collective formally withdrew from the Council, declaring that they could no longer support an organization that protected atrocities in the name of order. Council, speak of Exthal, called an emergency session, but only 8 of the 12 species attended. The others were dealing with their own internal problems as subject species began demanding independence and equal treatment. Jake Harrison was finally released from his diplomatic quarters and allowed to address the council. One more time, the chamber that had once seemed so imposing now felt different. Half the platforms were empty, and those that remained showed beings who looked uncertain and afraid. Ambassador Harrison, council speaker, Vextel said, her voice lacking its former authority, the situation has become complicated since your last address. Jake looked around the chamber. The towering platforms that had once seemed to represent ultimate power now looked like monuments to a dying age. Council Speaker, Jake replied, the situation was always complicated. The difference is that now everyone knows it.
Representative.
Caltex of the Hydranian Assembly spoke from her water-filled platform. Ambassador Harrison, your actions have destabilized the entire galactic order. Rebellions are breaking out on dozens of worlds. Peace we have maintained for centuries is collapsing. Jake nodded slowly. You're right, the old peace is ending, but maybe it's time to build a new kind of peace. One based on justice instead. Of convenience, session was interrupted by an urgent communication from the Outer Rim territories. The Andromedan mining colonies had declared independence and were asking for human assistance in establishing their own government. More messages followed. The Ethereal Collective was forming a new alliance with species that had withdrawn from Council authority. Even some Zephyrian worlds were asking to join this new confederation of free worlds. President Mitchell, watching from Earth, made a decision that would reshape galactic civilization. She authorized the creation of the Galactic Federation of Free Worlds, an organization based on principles Jake Harrison had articulated in his rejection speech. Every thinking being has the right to freedom, President Mitchell announced in her broadcast to the galaxy. Every species has the right to determine its own destiny. These are not human principles. They are universal principles that we invite all beings to embrace. The response was overwhelming. Within weeks, 47 species had applied to join the new federation. They ranged from major powers like the Ethereal Collective to small colonies that had never been allowed to speak for themselves. Jake Harrison returned to Earth not as a failed diplomat, but as the architect of a new galactic order. The Aurora docked at Luna Station, 2 crowds of humans and aliens who had come to witness the return of the man who had changed everything by simply saying no. But Jake's first stop was not a celebration or a press conference. It went directly to the refugee camps to meet the people whose freedom had started it all. Dr. Elena Asquez met him at the main camp on New Geneva. Jake, I want you to meet someone special. She led him to a small building where Zephyrian children were attending school with human teachers. One young Zephyrian named Kexler looked up as Jake entered. Are you the human who said no to the bad people? Kexler asked in halting English. Jake knelt down to the child's level. I'm the human who said that your life matters more than any law or treaty. Kexler smiled, the first time Dr. Vasquez had seen the child show happiness since arriving. At the camp, my teacher says I can ask questions now. She says asking questions is good, it's very good, Jake replied. Questions are how we learn, how we grow, how we become better. The Galactic Council tried to maintain its authority, but the old system was finished. Species continued to withdraw, forming their own alliances based on mutual respect rather than imposed order. High Counselor Zertek was eventually captured by his own former generals and put on trial for crimes against sentient life. The consciousness transfer program was dismantled, and the surviving victims were given new bodies grown from their own genetic material. The Zephyrian Empire reformed as the Zephyrian Republic. Led by former dissidents, who had once been marked for processing. They applied for membership in the Federation of Free Worlds and were accepted after demonstrating their commitment to individual rights. 1 year after Jake's rejection, he stood before the first assembly of the Galactic Federation of Free Worlds. The chamber was smaller than the old council building, but it was filled with representatives who had earned their seats through the support of their people rather than the accident of ancient power. "We are not here because we are the strongest," Jake told the assembly. "We are here because we chose to be better. We chose justice over convenience. We chose principle over survival. We chose to build something new rather than preserve something broken." The galaxy was not perfect. There were still conflicts, still problems to solve, still species that preferred the old ways of doing things. But it was no longer a place where atrocities could hide behind legal language, where cruelty could wrap itself in the flag of order. In the end, Jake Harrison had not just saved 50,000 refugees. He had saved the soul of galactic civilization itself. And it all started with one simple word: no.